two books that some of you may be familiar with that I published over the years. One is Peace Building in Community Colleges, which is now a good 8 years old, maybe older than that now, which was where Jennifer Haydell wrote a chapter and other people looked at what peace in community colleges look like, right? And then the most recent book that I wrote was in 2016 that looked at careers in the field, which a number of community colleges actually use with their own students. So I've got a colleague of mine who teaches peace studies at Nassau Community College in Long Island. She uses with her students. I was on a call with students at the University of Oregon in a master's degree program, and they use the book with their students. So it's a way of kind of understanding what careers might look like. When I started thinking about careers years ago, and part of it has to do with my own time that I spent in community college, where I was running a paralegal studies program. And those of you who know what paralegal studies and a lot of community colleges programs look like, is it's all about getting a job, starting a career. I started to think about this in terms of peace, and then I started to recognize that I guess times people have talked about what a career could look like, and it reminded me of Eleanor Roosevelt in particular, because Eleanor Roosevelt, sorry, I'm going to do it this way. Does everybody still see my screen? And they see what they're supposed to, okay. That Eleanor Roosevelt said once, it was kind of relative to thinking about peace, is that it's certainly not enough to merely want peace, we would say, if you think about it that way. You have to be more than wanting it. You have to be more than thinking about it. You have to work at it, right? And what does work look like? When we think about work, we normally think in terms of, well, peace is something that I would work at in my own life or on the weekends, or I'd be an activist, or I'd see family disputes and so forth, and I try to kind of work them out and so forth. But one of the things that I came to recognize is that in a way, peace can very much be this notion of peace being a career, right? And what does that look like for people? And at times we've had a much more confined notion about what a peace career is. And what I try to do, at least in my book and in my work, is kind of open that up more broadly for people to recognize it. This isn't a thread trying to get through the needle. It's much bigger opportunities that are out there. One of the things that I always point out when I talk to students and talk to faculty is that there are plenty of needs that we have around the world. We have poverty, we have overpopulation, we have pollution, we have employment displacement, certainly big shifting work. And these somehow are all issues that relate with conflict and differences at times. This is a picture from the Ebola outbreak a couple of years ago. We have the pandemic. These also have notions of peace related to them, because how do you create a peaceful society after a pandemic? I just remind people, this is my one on religion, just to drive carefully. But also we have differences as a result of religion too. Honk if you love Jesus, text while driving if you want to meet him. So, just to be careful. One of the big issues in our country in the last couple of years have been, how do we view ourselves versus people who arrive at our country in various ways? Do they arrive by crossing a border in a very surreptitiously, some might say an illegal way, or do they come through some sort of visa process? I'm working right now with a number of Afghan refugees, Ahmed being one from yesterday, and other, and trying to get them to come to the country. We have one of the challenges we're going to be dealing with have to do with generational ageism, or not ageism as much as kind of how some segments are growing faster, and people in my age group, 60 on up, are growing quite fast. And how do you support our needs and not overburden people who are younger? And then, I'm talking about conflict and peace in the last slide I showed you. This last slide is showing you a picture of who are people going to war. I think we talked about these issues 25 years ago. I'd probably just show you the war slide and you would understand it. but now there's so many different issues that deal with conflict and peace and differences. And then this is an aid worker, right? So what's the role of you as the aid worker? What is it that you can do in each one of these spaces? I mean, this really got you to think about what was being raised by Kira and her colleagues last hour, in thinking about, well, what are individual roles that we can take? The other thing that I recognize in dealing with this work, particularly when talking to students, is that no matter what we talk about in terms of career or jobs or skills, it's always going to be constructed by the culture of the environment, right? So Generation Z is the generation we're looking at right now. And my daughter is a Generation Z, my son is a millennial, right? And they're actually slightly different in their view of things also in some respects. Even though they're only 5 years apart, they're different generations. Generation Z is going to be the largest members of the workforce. It's right now it's millennials, but it's going to increase. So when we're thinking about work and what they do, and we think about peace, shouldn't we then think in terms of what Generation Z is looking for in work, right? So if they're looking for work-life balance, right, becomes much important to them, or if they're looking for certain types of office culture, how do we then integrate notions of peace and conflict, or just this whole idea of bridging differences in the workplace that would make a workplace of what they expect and what they're looking for? When I talk about peace, this is something that I've been focusing on for a long time, and some of you may have heard this from me, is that generally we look at peace in two different ways. We often look at it as an end state, right? That this is peaceful. Maybe it's values like peace sign and war and peace, or maybe some people equate peace with patriotism. And if you talk to a service person who'd served in Iraq or Afghanistan, they might say that, I went there to keep the peace, right? That's what I did. These are often diametrically opposed views in people, right? Not everybody thinks the same. Sometimes peace is what they associate with their faith, right? So I'm in a state of peace when I'm in a mosque or in a temple or in other types of environments. Sometimes people, well, I love this one, right? Peace is sitting by the beach, right? It's that kind of state of being, of kind of, maybe it's contemplative, right? But peace, this is kind of an interesting one. This is wires at a correctional institution, right? Some people would say, well, peace is when people have committed a crime and I've been the victim or I have been victimized. A state of peace for me is when that person is serving some time or that person has been punished, if you will, right? So peace often is solved as an end, when I think the idea of peace as means becomes more popular, and this really relates back to what Kira was talking about, is that the dialogic process of talking and spending time with people and getting to know them and know their understandings is really what peace really should be constituting. Where it ends up may not be as important as the means that's being used. This is more of a diplomatic negotiation, you would say. This is more of a dialogue. Peace as means could be the work that you do, the humanitarian work, right? You're alleviating people's suffering and the things that make their life really difficult. Peace as protest, right? And then peace as education, right? So one of the things is that education is a means, right? And so this means to being able to sustain yourself, to develop these skills that allow you to live with other people in a peaceful way. And this doesn't always mean getting a college degree. It can be all kinds of education that apply that. So I often want people to shift from the ends to the means. The ends very much are politicized, and they are like, we argue about religion, we argue about patriotism, we argue about a lot of things, but the means rarely do we argue about. We know people have a right to do these things and that they should be doing these different engagements. In thinking about careers, one of the things I also remind people is that 60% of jobs 10 years from now haven't been created yet. This is a quote from Thomas Fry, who used to be the editor of the Futurist magazine. And maybe the numbers aren't right, but the concept definitely is right, right? So if you think about if you're a young person in your 20s, you probably didn't know how things had changed. But if you're of my age or older, the way things have changed in the last 20 years or 30 years is just, I think about Rip Van Winkle falling asleep in the Catskills and waking up 20 years later and thinking that things have changed. This would really blow Rip Van Winkle's mind, how things have changed if he had fallen asleep, 15 years ago or 20 years ago and thinking about what's going on today. So, and that will continue. And that's just not the tech field, right? You often think, well, all that changing is in the tech field. It's in every field. It's in healthcare. It's in service industry. It's in, kind of government in a sense. All these things are changing what they do. This is a picture of my father. And my father was a letterpressman. And if I said letterpressman, most people would say, I have no idea what that is. Well, if you're my age, and I was his apprentice, so I know what it is. So if you kind of look at what my father's doing, my father's taking a case and he's putting type in it. And what he's going to do is put down a printing press and he's going to put paper and ink and it's going to produce written documents. That's how we used to do it in the day, right? We don't do it that way anymore. And that type case in the back of him that you see, you now buy these in curio shops for $50 when we had a whole house full of them with type in them, lead type, right? And my father, that's what he did for most of his life. He set that and that's how he earned his living and put me through college and supported our family. My father's job doesn't exist anymore. And the way you produce written documents or written materials are very, very different. But, that's how that took a long time to change. Didn't happen overnight like other things are changing, but we are going through these changes. This is not a joke. So when I start talking to people about careers, whoever they are, I always want to say that this is real. And so am I suggesting to you that a peace job or a peace building career means that you have to work as a barista? Maybe, I would say. Because I know a lot of you are saying, well, being a barista at Starbucks is just not what I want to do as my peace building or conflict resolution career. Okay, I hear you. But I would say entrepreneurship could be, right? So could you imagine yourself opening a business like a coffee shop, right? This is in Minneapolis, St. Paul area. There are like five branches of Peace Coffee. It uses fair trade coffee and so forth. It's everything you would think. Could this be, getting a job? We think about getting a job versus we think about creating a job. And creating a job might be you do something yourself. You could consult or whatever it is. But could you start a business, any type of business, and say, well, I'm expressing certain values as a result of that? This is more scenes from Peace Coffee. This is a Peace Tech Lab. Peace Tech Lab is an offshoot of the U.S. Institute of Peace. Some of you may know that I worked there for 10 years. USIP started getting involved in understanding how technology impacted war and conflict probably 20 years ago. And then eventually they created Peace Tech Lab as being the vehicle, and now Peace Tech Lab is separate. So here is, what does technology do in monitoring war and violence, preventing it, helping peaceful transitions? I mean, with the world of social media and all the things that we can do through the internet, what are all the means that we can use, right, in order to make the world a peaceful way? And I point this out because you often have people who are gravitating to the field that, well, they might be kind of tech backgrounds. That's what they're really interested in, right? They like, and maybe all Generation Z people have tech backgrounds today. How do they take a tech background and they don't want to do they don't want to do the activism. They don't want to work with refugees. They don't want to do that stuff. They want to use their tech stuff. You can use your tech stuff in that way. This is a picture of my son. My son, who was in the Peace Corps for 2 years, now he works for EPA, but he was in the Peace Corps and he taught mathematics in Namibia. You can go into the Peace Corps irrespective of your age and irrespective of your college degree too. I don't know if people recognize that. People often think, well, I have to have a bachelor's degree in the Peace Corps. No. And the Peace Corps doesn't allow me to go at a certain age. No. all you have to do is ask Jimmy Carter about his mom, and I'll leave it there. Those of you old enough to remember Lillian Carter, who went into the Peace Corps when she was 74, I think. But this is one means of which people will take on in order to feel like they're working for peace. And really, you're working for education, you're using education as a means for peace. And my son was in Namibia, and it was transformative experience for him. I put this up, and it's both for the parents in the room and for the children in the room, because I want them to think that when their parents start kind of encouraging them to kind of look at the things in the attic and make some claims on things, and the kids who say, I don't want any of that stuff, understanding that this is not a unique conversation you're having. But what the message of it is that Jeremy, who is the star of this comic strip, which I read every week, is suggesting his mom is that, I'm not going to have an office. I'm not even going to have an apartment. I'm just going to be traveling the world from gig to gig, right? And a lot of the peace work that people do today kind of looks like that, right? They're not like working in some place. They're going from deployment to deployment, or working from one coast to the other. And with virtual, it's virtual gigs at that. It's maybe you're not even physically going, but you're working in places temporarily and going on to something else. So let me talk to you a little bit about the construction of work in the field, and talk a little bit about that. And we'll take questions at the end. And so go ahead and put stuff in the chat box if you want to. We'll come back to it. When people think about the work of peace and conflict generally, one of the things that I first like to get them to recognize is the actual physical work of what you do, what somebody does, basically happens at three different levels, right? At one level, people who do this kind of work are working in we'll say the micro environment. That is, they're working one-on-one with somebody. They are a mediator, or they're working with refugees, or they're working in a domestic violence clinic. They're working directly with people, often in a very intimate way, in order to respond to maybe the person's been a victim or been targeted, or maybe prevent conflict, or really help people transition away from conflict. There's also the meso level, and the meso level tends to be kind of group action and working within groups and movements. So I think about Black Lives Matter, I think about other types of like immigrant movements, is that often where your focus is not so much in working intimately, but kind of in bringing people together in order to put an issue forward, right? And that might be the meso level. And then finally, there's the macro, and the macro tends to be kind of the way out there, the 50,000 feet, like the UN, we would say, or policy and things that are kind of high out there. And people who say, I want to do diplomatic work, they're kind of working at the macro level. And people say, well, I want to be a community activist, they're working at the meso level. And people that say, I want to be a mediator, they're working at the micro level, if you will. Sometimes these three levels don't communicate with each other very well. They just don't know each other, which is unfortunate. So the notion of direct versus indirect relates to the work that you do, right? And so for many years, there was the notion that direct action was where kind of peace work happened as a diplomat or humanitarian worker or a mediator. And I remember early on when I was working, I know when I started working at the US Institute of Peace, I was often working with young high school and college students, and they would come to me and say, oh, I really want to do that work, right? And then they would say, what kind of jobs can I get? And it's like, not many, like this was my list. And then I started to think, well, maybe not. Maybe you take the skills that you develop in developing, like, say, the urban rural action, skills of dialogue or understanding, right? And you take that, and where can you apply that? You could apply that anywhere, right? You could apply that as an educator, as a journalist, as a business owner. You can take all the skills that you learn that focus on understanding, dialogue, assisting people who are downtrodden, responding to conflict, preventing conflict, increasing understanding, and you can apply them anywhere. And that's what I want people to think about, is that it's not a particular job, it's what you can do in doing the skills in a particular space. And so often I'm dealing with people who said, I'd like to do more work in this area, and there's a need where I work, I just can't figure out how to do it. And then so we're crafting, how do you then create that space where you're working to do those things that might not be so self-aware, self-apparent in some respects. This is I'm not going to go through this in great deal, the more complicated construct that was developed by John Paul Lederach maybe about 15 years ago, and looking at the field mostly in an international context and using the word peace building as often the broader framing. And I look at my own work, for instance, like I do a lot of humanitarian work through the Forge Center. We do humanitarian training. So we train college, and we work with high schools, college, university professionals. So we're also working in education and training, right, in order to work in the field. But I've also spent a lot of my time over the years as a mediator, working with communities, working in community mediation, working in family mediation. I don't work directly in development, but I support a lot of development work, and development is like USAID, And so all of these things here are often things that you can connect with, and the things that you're doing are the things that you can be doing. So talk a little bit about the future. So having said all of this and kind of framed in a certain way, the question is always, well, what's the future hold? Well, the reality is we're not sure what the future is going to hold, right? Because it's changing so quickly. But Gary Marks wrote a book, I guess it was about 2 years ago, about trends in the 21st century. And he was looking at trends and helping educators think about what they should be doing with their students. And one of the things is for sure is that we're not going to have any less need for diplomatic skills, promoting curiosity, ability to negotiate, a sense of tolerance. We know that those are going to be needed in the future, right? And if those are going to be needed in the future, then how do we create opportunities for ourselves where we can really do this maybe as a living, right? Soft skills also, this idea that in a competitive world, softer skills, that is skills that deal not so much with the technical, putting something together, kind of maybe tech, kind of computer-based, but skills that might relate to, if you will, understanding and dialogue and getting together and encouraging and teamwork and supporting. Those aren't going to go away. They're still going to be needed in the future. In fact, this is an interesting graphic that comes from LinkedIn a couple of years ago. They were looking at the top 10 most important soft skills. Communication. Well, communication is a lot of different things, recognize. It's not only speaking, it's actually listening. I say listening is often more important than the speaking part of communication. But these are all things that are really important to all work, but particularly come out of conflict resolution work. You do really see a lot of focus of that on that. The other thing that I like remind people of is that there's a place for meaning and purpose in your work. When people think about work, they think about a job or a career or a calling. And I think there was a generation where work was all about a job. You kind of you got work to pay the bills and put food on the table and those kind of things, pay your rent and your mortgage. And then there's a career that often comes with higher levels of professionalization and education. And then there's something as a calling, which really is self-actualization, that you kind of come and you recognize that this is kind of what I'm supposed to do on this planet, right? This is where I give my most gifts. This understanding comes a lot through the field of positive psychology, which I'm a big student of and I use a lot in my work. Probably about 10% people kind of reach that calling stage. But I think in our field, in the peace and conflict field, there's a much higher percentage of people that reach that calling stage. If I talk to mediators and I talk to other people in the field, what you will find is I'm going to show you another slide later, you will find a lot of people do this work are saying, I guess I could make more money doing something else, or I could have better hours, but I do this because I'm just called to this work. This is just such important work for me in what I'm doing. I'm going to send this all to you. This is called the napkin test. The napkin tests help you determine or help you think about what a calling is. And it looks at, what are your gifts? What are your passion? What are your values? And you add that all up and that kind of equals what it is that you get up in the morning to do. part of a calling is this idea that when I get up in the morning, I really feel energized at what I'm doing. So I'm not going to do it now, but we'll come back to it. All right, so let's talk about community colleges for a minute. So having said all of this, right, what's important is to recognize is that from a community college standpoint, these demographics might not be so apparent to you, and you don't think about all the time, though it's standing right in your face. If you're a student, if you're a faculty member, if you're a staff person, community colleges are the most diverse education environments in the country, right? And they're diverse from all different ways, from demographics, from ethnic, religious, from kind of lifestyle, from from age. It's just so different, and why people come to community colleges. They really represent mainstream America. Tell you a little bit about the things that I've been focusing on community colleges and trying to bring peace to community colleges, and then talk about curriculum, is that I wish community colleges did a lot more than they do. That's why I'm so glad that Urban Rural Action is doing something. And I have spent 25 years trying to light a fire under community colleges to get more into the peace business, if you will. And I've done it from lots of different angles. This is an article in Community College Daily from 2 years ago about the last live program we did on peace building at George Mason University. And it features talking about programs at Valencia College, Paul Chapman, and I don't know if Paul is here today, in what they're doing. This other was a commentary that I was critical of the Fulbright program and not bringing enough community college faculty into it. And I know there are people here who've been the Fulbright program. I think Tulin Levitas has been in the Fulbright program. It's tremendously underrepresented community college-wise. And so there are things that community colleges are either not treated fairly or not have acted on for themselves to do. Some of the things that I have done is, this is a talk that I gave 2 years ago at a Maryland Community College conference, and talking about global learning opportunities and looking at community colleges through kind of a peace building angle. And the other thing on the right is an op-ed that I published in Community College Daily about, maybe it was about a month ago. Oh no, it's back in August, it's a couple months ago, in looking at what community colleges can do for Afghan refugees. If you remember back, those of you old enough remember when people came from Vietnam, what they ended up doing is going to community colleges to learn English. And community colleges were really great places for Vietnamese to start. Community colleges could be doing a lot more right now, and they could be playing the same role. This is a program that I do, and it's really part of this program. This program here is a program I do with Northern Virginia Community College for the last 7 or 8 years that brings international students to place them. It's called the Community College Initiative Program in, I guess, 6 or 7 community colleges in the United States, internationals for a year. And they take courses, and I give them a talk on peace building. And they're actually having they're doing it again this year. Now it's finally, they were kind of in a virtual space for a while, and then bring their students. It's something you're interested in. It's an education culture affairs partnership that works. And this is a program that I do with community colleges on entrepreneurship. I always want to get students to think about what they could do in their career. I mentioned before this idea of why people do this kind of work, and this is just something that a colleague of mine, Susan Raines, recognized when she did a study, I guess going back about 5 or 6 years, and that people who do conflict work are doing it because it's a calling. And she had surveyed, 40 or 50 people in the field, and she asked them why they're doing it. And they were all kind of people who were older, 40s and 50s, and they were saying, I'm doing this because I'm trying to make it a better world. And this, if this is where your space is and where you think about things, you're in a good space. So let's talk about faculty and staff pathways, and then I just got a couple more slides and we can take questions. My own journey to doing this actually started in the Fulbright program. And I mentioned the Fulbright program before. This is a write-up that I did about the Fulbright program. I had a Fulbright grant when I was in community college. I went overseas to Estonia. I taught peace studies and conflict resolution for a semester, so I was very fortunate. That kind of led me to doing a lot of international education work. And I often think that my road to this was unique for me. I was fortunate, and it opened up all kinds of doors for me. Not every faculty or staff person has the same opportunities, but I would say that international education is a really important means to doing peace and conflict work, right? Because it allows you to bring in the international into your classroom. It allows you to focus on things that are kind of happening in the world with your students, particularly as many community colleges, not just rural, not just urban, rural community colleges, becoming more and more internationalized. So I recommend, for instance, the Fulbright program for people in community colleges. And I'm often talking to community college faculty and staff about how they get into the Fulbright program. I also think about community action, right? Community action and social justice. So while some community colleges will say, well, it's the international education end I need to go to, the idea that there's so much to do in our communities, right? And so you could say, well, what I really want to do is I want to work in my community to promote social justice or community action. Peace education is an often important means of that. So teaching peace education with your students, getting them to think about how to be peaceful in their community, how they can, I apologize for I'm getting some construction in my house too, as I might have mentioned before, how they can promote peace education and be an activist in the community becomes important. Organizational change. So faculty might say, well, maybe what I need to do is work within my own space in my community college and making change in order to allow for more discussion of change and disputes. So for instance, I know faculty in community colleges have tried to start mediation programs in their colleges, for instance, or they're trying to improve the governance process of their college. Certainly professional development becomes important, right? And this often relates to you as a faculty or staff member saying, do I go to professional development that enhances my ability to teach or to train or to work in these areas? Are there associations that I can join? And I can tell you associations that I'm part of, including the Association for Conflict Resolution, the Peace and Justice Studies Association, and other groups. Are there trainings that I can get that would make me a better instructor, right? Are there trainings that I can get that would allow me then to think about how do I incorporate dialogic processes into my classroom? Or how do I, learn about how to teach about a certain issue that I'm not familiar with right now? So, and that may not lead to developing new courses. It may just lead to being able to teach what I always teach in a different way, right? And then further education. I'm not going to go to this link, but this is a link of masters and doctoral programs that exist. So you're never too late to go back to school, right? I'm 62 and I'm in a graduate certificate program, and I love it. And so wherever you are in your career, going back to school and getting a graduate certificate or a PhD or a master's in order to change the trajectory of what you could teach and what you could do, focusing on peace or conflict resolution is something you can do. And then probably the most promising, or what I would say, is encore careers, right? So the longer I'm in the field, the more that I hear about my colleagues who are retiring and going on to other things, which I think is so wonderful and has such great potential, but they're not done, right? It's not like they're saying, well, I'm kind of hanging it up. They're thinking, now what do I do? And so I've worked with a number of colleagues who say, okay, I'm going to stop teaching, but I really want to do is I want to do community work, or I want to go overseas, or I want to work with an NGO, or I want to do this, or I want to do that, or I want to be a mediator, or I want to do. So there's all these Concord careers that are open to you that basically allow you to go to the next space, right? And often in that situation, having a mentor or a career coach, I'm a career coach and I work with people like this, is really important, because that transition from the day you retire from teaching 30 years at such and such community college to the next year, what are you going to do with that, becomes really important at working through that. So this is something that's kind of critical also. Program development, really quickly, a lot of people are thinking about how do we develop programs in the field. This is an article that I'd sent you earlier in your email that I wrote for this publication a couple of years ago that looks at what developing a peace studies program might look like. And that's also what's in my book. This is a list that I have on my website. I'm not going to go to it right now because I'd rather take some questions and have some discussion that looks at community colleges around the United States. And it's a list of community colleges around the United States. There are some really stellar peace and conflict programs at Valencia College, Cuyahoga Community College, Golden West College that really have talked about it. If you go to this part of my website, you can get linked to it. Looking at the boundaries is really important in the field, right? One of the things that I think about where the work is going to be is intersectionality. I think if we talked 20 years ago, we wouldn't have thought that refugees and climate had a connection, and now they do, and it's called protecting climate refugees. So where you want to work often is in the boundaries. This is another, I saw this in the subway in Washington a couple of years ago. I thought, wow, if Einstein and Gandhi had gotten together, what could they have really done? Blue Jeans is like a Skype company, but it gets you to think about how people can collaborate. This is edition of ACR resolution, which I can also send you a link. ACR is the Magazine Association of Conflict Resolution. They talk about the future of conflict resolution and peace work. So there was an article that I wrote about people getting in the field and so forth. So I can send you this. This is kind of my last slide. Find your passion, get the right education, engage in activities, find your community, work in the right environment. Those are all really important in the field. Anybody recognize anybody here? I'll help you out. You've got to recognize this person. It's Martin Luther King. He's 16 years old. He's a student at Morehouse College. It's 1944. Morehouse College and a lot of schools let in people early. Is it Morehouse College or Spelman? I think it's Morehouse. Spelman's a women's college, right? Let in students early to study. He always sat in the front of the classroom. So the thing I always say is, if you always sit in the front of the classroom, you're never going to stand in the back of the bus. All right, and I'll stop there. And I know I've gone a little long. And so questions that you have, questions you've put in the chat, just open your mics, things that got you to think about things about careers, things I didn't talk about. Tell me, ask me, please, anybody. You have no questions, just open your mic.
Right. David, I'm interested in, I'm at the stage where I'm coming up on 30 years. Mm-hmm. Very interested in chatting about, encore careers, especially travel related, international related. My co-curricular passion right now, even though I'm teaching like communications, English, and a little bit of culture, is underwater archaeology.
Oh, yes, I know. We've talked about that before. Carolyn, I want to make sure you're not underwater today, right?
I was supposed to be, but no, they scrubbed the dive because of that weird weather yesterday.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk,
So how do you go about like counseling somebody? And hopefully maybe you've written a article
I've written a lot of articles, but one of it is just where you're starting. Is like, what are the things you're interested in, which tends to relate to the things that you're good at, right? So we really start off in the things that you are good at. Not that you can't improve other things, but sometimes this idea of what you have and building from that becomes really important. And if you've got freedom and you've got kind of stability, you've got, we'll say, the architecture or the scaffolding that supports what you're doing, there are lots of things that you can do. So yeah, let's talk on the other side and give you some ideas of where you can go with this. But yeah, I'm glad you're thinking that way. And I know we've talked about underwater stuff before, I know, in archaeology. So anybody else? Any other thoughts? How about the students are in the room here? Shannon, Dylan, I think you're here because are you interested in careers in this field?
Shannon? Go ahead, Dylan. Just interested in careers, but more perhaps like, the technology related. Like I'm a computer science major right now, and I'm taking this peace studies course, which I found like a very interesting topic because I don't really get to think of peace much. When I think of peace, it's very basic. But ever since taking the class, the scope has been broadened a bit. So I'm still thinking about like all the I don't know, just thinking in general, I guess.
Mhm. When are you finishing up at Golden West?
So my counselor recommended me to stay 3 years in total, so I'm in my second year right now.
Okay. Yeah, we can talk again. I mean, a lot. Are you thinking about transferring on somewhere?
Yes, I'm mostly thinking either my big choice is Cal State Fullerton, and I would like to go to Cal Poly Pomona, but it's a little further from home.
So there are lots of things. You don't have to study peace studies in order to do this work. That's the one thing I always tell people. You can study anything, right? But what you have to do is you have to kind of develop the skills and the aptitudes that you can apply in conflict situations, basically. And you can do that in many different ways. And you can do that through experience. Have you ever thought about doing study abroad?
No, not really. I'm a home guy.
You're a home guy. Okay. Yeah, we can talk again. And Fran is a good friend of mine, so I can talk to her a little bit more. And how about you, Shannon? What are you thinking?
Well, I'm a musician, so I'm always considering a different career. But I just went back to school because during the pandemic, I thought, why not finish up my college degree? And I am majoring in music composition, but I do want to have a life of being involved in peace building in some way.
Yeah.
I just don't really know where I'm best suited.
Yeah. Well, once again, it comes down to what you're interested in, but also looking at what you're good at, right?
Mhm.
And what I do with people, and this also relates to what Carolyn was saying, is that I use a technique called appreciative inquiry with my colleagues, with my clients, and the people I work with, for us to think about, it's an organization development theory, to think about what are the things that you really have had great success at. What are the experiences you've had and the skills and the abilities you've brought to that? Because that's the stepping stone. And I'm not saying what you're interested in doesn't align with that. Doesn't always align with it though. But if there's an alignment between what you're interested in and what you're good at, then what you go for are the things that support the things that you're good at, right? So a lot of people will say, well, I like to do conflict work, but I don't like working with people one-on-one, but I want to be a mediator. And I'm thinking, you're not going to be a mediator if you don't like working with people one-on-one. What is it that you like doing? And they say, well, what I like doing is I like doing research. I like doing those kinds of things. Well, then there are lots of conflict stuff that you can do. It's just not going to be mediation, right? So we have to kind of think about what is it that you really are good at and building it from there. So thanks, Shannon.